Brian Bonde, and it's great to have you here today. You're actually in my office in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. It is the end of March 2022, and I know that you are here because this was a presentation that hopefully I'm going to give at the International Fundraising Conference for AFP. So let's go ahead and we will begin that session. I'm going to share my screen here. I'm using Zoom to record this, and so we'll be going back and forth just like you're used to in any Zoom presentation. So our presentation today is when will my board grow up? We're managing the phases, the predictable phases of board development. Like I said, I'm Brian Bonde, ACFRE, Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I'm a consultant. Let me tell you a little bit more about myself. Been in this business over 30 years, and I started in higher education, ended up being the vice president of development for a university. I moved from there into the social services world, worked for a children's hospital and statewide service provider for children with disabilities, moved from there to a large university health system. And then I decided, I think it's time to start the consulting firm that I've always wanted to start. And so I worked with the healthcare system I was with, and they became my first client. And I've been doing that now for over 10 years. I work in primarily fundraising, but as I've worked in the fundraising world, I've discovered that board development, if your board is not in good shape, your organization is not in good shape. And if your organization is not in good shape, then you can't do fundraising. And so in my practice, while I started out focusing on fundraising, and I've spent a lot of time focusing on governance and helping with board development, and of course, planning and strategic planning and those sorts of things. The theme of my company is working with people that desire to lead great organizations and raise more money. And you can see from what is on the screen, I want to help people that desire to lead great organizations first. Because if you have a great organization, it's a whole lot easier to raise more money. And creating a great organization means having great governance. It means developing a great board. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Now, before we dive into that, I'm going to take this captured moment in order to do a couple commercial messages for AFP and things that I hold dear. First of all, you can see I am an ACFRE, and that means that I am an advanced certified fundraising executive. I'm hoping that you have discovered the importance of certification in your career, and that if you are not working towards your CFRE, you are doing that if you're younger in your career. If you are already a CFRE, the ACFRE is the appropriate next step for you to take in the advancement of your career. It's been very important to me not only to be able to say I've done it and be part of this group of 100+ people who have this advanced certification, but it's also given me access to some of the great minds in fundraising. And I hope you will take the opportunity to explore becoming an ACFRE. You can see there's just a few people on the screen there that are my colleagues. And it is the next natural step to demonstrate your philanthropic leadership. I won't talk about it too much, but consider being an advanced certified fundraising executive and going through the process. The next thing I want to talk about, I've been on lots and lots of boards, and I am the past chair of the AFP Foundation for Philanthropy. The AFP Foundation for Philanthropy is close to my heart because it really takes what AFP does and takes it to the next step. A lot of the things that happen with AFP, people didn't even realize come from funding that is made available through the foundation. Leadership development, things like scholarships and the leadership program and AFP Lead. IDEA, inclusion, diversity, equity, and access. We fund diversity scholarships. We put together the mentoring program that AFP runs. Research, the Fundraising Effectiveness Project. If you haven't explored the Fundraising Effectiveness Project, go to the AFP website or Google it. And every quarter, the Fundraising Effectiveness Project puts out some of the great data on what's going on in our business and in our sector. Research grants, the research prize, also support ethics, of course, which is a key part of what goes on with AFP, and also, of course, being a professional fundraiser and being certified. Ethics Awareness Month and the Endowed Ethics Funds. So consider a gift to the foundation. I would also say, if you're interested in moving forward in leadership roles with AFP, the AFP Foundation is a great place to really get engaged. So consider that as well. Okay, the commercial time's done. Let's go back to what we want to really talk about today. And I want to start with the philosophy behind my company. I've told you about the theme, but the philosophy is based on this statement. Anyone who has known me very long, has got an email from me or any communication from me, sees this statement on all of my material. The true meaning of life is to plant trees under whose shade you do not expect to sit. Everything begins with a seed. Everything begins small, including boards, including organizations. And we're going to talk a lot about that today, about the idea of being a founder and the role the founder plays in planting a seed that grows into a giant tree, that becomes an organization that is bigger than us, bigger than the founder. It becomes a public trust. And I think this phrase fits in so many of the things that we do. The true meaning of life is to plant trees under whose shade you do not expect to sit. So as we have our conversations today, I want you to think about that phrase in a way that everything we do is bigger than we think. You know, we think about, okay, here's the annual fund or here's a major gift. Today, I need you to think bigger. I need you to think about the governance of the organization, how an organization starts, how it grows, what sort of environment does it work in. And those are some of the things that we'll be talking about today. I was with a friend, AFP friend in Chicago 6 or 7 years ago, and we went to this little play. You may have heard of it. And I was surprised to hear this phrase in the musical. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
I imagine death so much it feels more like a memory. Is this where it gets me? On my feet, several feet ahead of me. I see it coming. Do I run or fire my gun or let it be? There's no beast, no name. Bird, first friend, my enemy. The last face I ever see. If I throw away my shot, is this how you remember me? What if this bullet is my legacy? Legacy. What is a legacy? It's planting seeds in a garden you never get to see.
There it is. I was a little shocked when I went to Hamilton and I heard that phrase at the end. But it fits. Legacy. What is a legacy? It's planting seeds in a garden you never get to see. And that's what building a board, building an organization is about. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. I want to talk from the end first. As we talk about the kind of organization we want, I want to talk about what is the bigger issue. I want to talk about building tomorrow. This isn't just a matter of recruiting a board member or raising an annual fund dollar. I want to talk about your organization's future and the resources it will take to get there, especially when it comes down to your board. So today we're going to be talking about planting and nurturing trees. It's more than just one little part, but I want you to think about that bigger picture, and we'll come back to that. So keep your eye on the big picture, not the smaller, slightly fuzzy picture or the what a picture where department. I want you to raise your thoughts up to how organizations come to be and where you are in the development of your organization. First of all, I want you to think about how you feel about your board. I'm guessing that if you are here, you're not in this first category. Great. no problems. Maybe you are. Maybe you're looking just for some more information. But more than likely, as you're thinking about your board, you're going, okay, things are all right. There may not be worries, or maybe things are getting tough, or maybe you're starting to see things crack at the seams and you wonder why, what's going on, or maybe, help, things are falling apart. Hopefully, through the process we go through today, you'll be able to figure out why these things are happening, why you feel the way you do. How old is your organization? Is it new? Is it less than 3 years old? Was it created by a founder or a group of founders and it's trying to find its way? Is the organization still learning how to be an effective nonprofit organization? Maybe 3 to 5 years old. Is your organization getting there? Maybe 3 to 10 years old. You've got some experience under your belt as an organization. Maybe you've arrived. Maybe the organization is 10 to 20 years old and it's pretty well established and you've got your systems up and running. Maybe it's really well established. It's maybe 20 years or more, and it's become an institution in your community. I want you to think about these time frames, these ages. You know, organizations and human beings have phases of development we go through. Now, we all know that. When we think about children, we know what a baby is, and we know that there are steps that they have to go through, that they have to learn in order to move up to becoming a toddler and starting to make decisions and be able to function on their own a little bit. And then we get to those tough age of adolescence. I don't know about you. I don't want to go back to 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th grade at all, because those are tough years. Those are tough times of really big development and change. But those are also times that we had to go through to get to where we are today. Or maybe a young adult, 10 to 20 years, you kind of have your act together, but you're still learning. And then the adult of 20 or 20 plus years. So again, going back to your organization, apply that to the same kind of thinking we have about human beings. Organizations have predictable and understandable steps in development that they go through. Not exactly like we humans do, but think of the analogy and think about how much easier it might be for a board when they're having struggles to know this is a natural struggle that we need to go through to get to the next step of our development. Now, we all know that just because a human being is a certain age, it may not be emotionally at that age. So I want to know, is your board acting its age? Has it reached the point that it should have for the length of time the organization has been around and for all of the activities that have gone on with your board? I ask this question because I want to share a fairly big statement, and that is recognizing and understanding what phase your organization and the board are in is critical, because it really is often paramount to what successful outcomes your organization can achieve. If you don't know where you're at, it's very hard to know about where you're going. And so this can be a struggle. I love this poem, and I want to share this poem with you about the exciting part of diving into this. It's very easy. It's very easy to let a board sit where it's at, but we've got real work ahead of us. It may be that when we no longer know what to do, we have come to our real work. And that when we no longer know which way to go, we have come to our real journey. The mind that is not baffled is not employed, and the impeded stream is the one that sings. What I want to say to you is that we're going to be talking a lot about change, a lot about board changes, and this may not feel comfortable, but as you move through this journey, you'll start to hear the stream that sings. And going through and meeting the challenges is the real work I think that we have in our sector of helping our boards and our organizations move forward. Yes, certainly we got to raise money. We have to do finances. We have to do all of these other things, but we have to help the organization understand how can it grow into maturity. And that's the ultimate goal, is let's create mature, effective boards of directors. So what is a mature board? I want to sort of start at the end of our process so we know where do we want to end up. We're going to talk about a lot of things today, but if we're talking about a mature board of directors, we're talking about a board that governs and a staff that manages. Now, of course, you say that's the way it should be. What exactly does that mean? Let's talk about the board's role. The board is responsible to move the organization forward. It's the direction of the organization. It sets a vision for the future. When I talk about vision, I'm talking about what is it 15 years from now that we want to look back and see what we achieved? What is out on the horizon that is the vision of the organization and the impact we want to have? The board is responsible for setting that vision, governing, developing policy, and the board maintains focus on that vision as it helps you do the mission day by day. Okay, so what's the difference between vision and mission? Well, vision is what we want to be and what we want to do, where we want to end up out in the future. The mission is what we do day by day in order to meet that vision and those strategic goals. And we hope that our boards will not micromanage the staff and the organization as you're moving through this. Now, what's the role of the staff then? Well, the staff administrates all of this. The staff makes this happen. Now, the board has set a vision for us as staff. And what we want to do is advance to that mission or to that vision by meeting our mission day to day. We want to look at what's out there on the horizon, and we want to execute the mission, the goals, the objectives, the strategies, and the tactics that it takes day to day to take care of that daily operation. It's unique to our organization that will move us towards the vision that the board has set. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some material from Board Source as to what the real responsibilities of a board of directors are. One, establishing direction, vision, as I talked about, ensuring resources, and then providing oversight. So I want to talk about each one of those things. Let's first of all talk about establishing direction. It's strategic direction. Again, the board is responsible for the vision of the organization. Where do we want to be 15 years from now? And then developing and maintaining the focus on that vision and the mission. Now, they do that in a mature organization by delegating the authority of organizational management to usually a singular individual, chief executive officer, the executive director, the president. It could have all sorts of different names. But that's the board's role, is to select that leader who is going to make that happen. And they empower that person to make those decisions. Now, there's some decisions that the board has to be involved in. We'll talk about those. And then the board is responsible for articulating, safeguarding, modeling, and promoting the organizational values. What do you as an organization stand for? Can you articulate it? And then the board makes sure that they model it and safeguard those values. The next thing, let's talk about ensuring resources. We're all in fundraising, so we want to talk a little bit about money. The board develops the policies related to the generation of the financial resources. What is the guidelines for the organization for finances? And then ultimately, even though we may be doing the fundraising, it's the board's job to ensure that the necessary resources are made available for the implementation of that day-to-day mission that we were talking about. And then the board has connections that staff doesn't have. And oftentimes the board moves in different circles, both in the culture, within the programming, and within the financial strata that they work in. And they can help enhance our standing and help us raise more money because of those connections. And then the organization ensures that the leadership is in place both at the staff and the board level. So we're not talking just about money, but we're talking about human resources as well. The next thing is providing oversight to the organization, establishing financial policies and ensuring accountability to those policies, ensuring compliance and that the organization moves within applicable laws and, of course, ethical standards, and then monitoring that progress towards the strategic goals that I talked about, that vision out there, and then evaluating the outcome and working with staff to evaluate those outcomes. I want to talk a little bit further about the mature board of directors. Some of this comes from my good friend Simone Joyaux, and I think about her often. Simone passed away a little over a year ago, but so much of her information guides so many of us as we talk about board governance. The board is a collective, and oftentimes the board chair or individuals think that they have more authority than they do. But in fact, the board acts as a board. It doesn't act as a bunch of individuals. So the board votes, the board makes decisions, and they function and only have authority as a group. They exist to gather together as a group to talk about information that's vital to the organization, about its health, and they are able to take action as a group, speaking for the best of the organization. Again, this all happens together as a group through dialogue at board meetings. Now, an effective board understands that's how this happens. It's coming together, it's identifying problems, it's discussing those issues, coming to some conclusions about them, and then creating policies and procedures about how to conduct effective meetings and how to run the organization. An effective board focuses on strategic issues. Again, it's that vision thing rather than the routine matters. It's really the routine matters belong to the staff. The board focuses on ends. That is, where do we want this organization to be? What is the vision? Where do we want to be at 15, 20 years from now? Management and staff is focusing on the means. How do things get done day to day? How do things happen? Now, there's a very big difference between governance, which is what the board does, and management, which is what the staff does. But there are some similarities that overlaps, and there's a matter of judgment and organizational evolution. Now, one of the things that I really have had to study in my consulting practice is this whole idea of organizational evolution. This whole idea that, yes, boards develop, are created, they grow, and they mature, much like people do. The other thing I want to highlight is that there's a difference between the board, which is a group that comes together, makes decisions for the organization, and individual board members. It's important that individual board members don't take on bigger responsibility than they have as a member of the group of the board of directors, which makes the decisions. We'll be talking more about that because I think that particular thing, that difference between a board and its actions and the individual board members' actions, is a key point in measuring the maturity of a board and the organization. Now, what if, and here's a big but, what if there's no staff? That means the board does it all. This is especially true for a brand new organization. We'll talk about these steps. Or conversely, what if there's no board? That means there's the founder or the founders do it all. And how does that all work inside of this idea of a nonprofit organization that's supposed to have a board, a volunteer board, and then maybe some staff, and we'll get into all of that because there's everything in between here, between becoming a mature board of directors and the process and all of the steps it takes to get to that mature board of directors level. Years and years ago, I went to a program that AFP called ELI, the Executive Leadership Institute. And that was the first time I had really ever been introduced to this whole idea of civil society. And especially now, this is an international conference, so there may be people from outside of the United States or Canada or this region, of course. But what I'm really talking about is the organizations that grew out of the uniqueness of American civil society. It really grew out of US history of our democracy and this whole idea of a third sector. It's a third sector of society that it's not government and it's not business, but what it does is it does the work that government and business isn't doing. So these are our NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, and they fill the role that either government chooses not to fill, or the role that government can't fill. And sometimes nonprofit organizations get the idea and they transfer to government. My good friend Bob Carter, one of the wisest people in this business I know, talks about the role that nonprofit organizations, NGOs play in coming up with innovation and then trying to find scale. Sometimes we can get to scale by raising money or developing the resources in order to move forward. Sometimes it's the non-governmental organizations that bring that innovation to government, and government gives it scale. But that's a whole nother discussion. The next thing I want to talk about when we talk about civil society, I'm here in South Dakota on the prairies of Dakota, where if you wanted to get anything done, like this barn raising here, you'd gather the community together and you'd work as a community to build the barn. Yeah, that's true in our region. It's been true in the United States all along, whether it's a barn, whether it's a church, or whether it's a school. People come together to help each other to do that. And it's something that grew out of our history. And this third sector tries to fill this distance between theory and practice in American life. What we as a third sector try to do is fulfill what we say we are or say we want to be, and turn it into practice in American life to try to move towards a more perfect democracy and a more perfect union. So we're talking about nonprofit organizations that play a central part in our local, state, and national life. And in many ways, they're right inside the core of our politics, because what we do in nonprofit organizations is we address that deep tension of what our society actually is and what we want our society to be. And I think as you look over time, no matter what your thoughts are about the history of the United States, as we have moved forward, we have seen our country become more like the country that we wanted to be, and that the founders envisioned, or at least said they envisioned at the time that this country was created. And nonprofit organizations have played a key and very important part of that. And so our work is more than just fundraising or being a nonprofit organization that provides this service. We're actually helping to build and move towards a better country and a better society. I want to go back to some writings that Tocqueville had. Some of you certainly have read these. A friend of mine here in South Dakota, a Native American, said, "Have you read anything else that Tocqueville's written? If you did, you probably wouldn't be quoting them." So I'm not going to talk about that part of that, but I want to talk about this part of Tocqueville because it provides a historical context. He was in France and he was in America in 1831. It says Americans of all ages, conditions, and depositions constantly unite together. Americans group together to hold festivals, found seminaries, build inns, construct churches, distribute books. They established prisons and schools by the same method. And I have frequently admired the endless skill at which the inhabitants of the United States managed to set a common aim to the efforts of a great number of people to persuade them and pursue what they want to do voluntarily. Up until the American democracy grew up, this idea of people of all sectors coming together in order to achieve something by creating a brand new organization was a fairly unique idea. Now, how did this become formalized into our government? A lot of people don't realize that there were the Revenue Acts of 1913 through 1918 that created our modern federal income tax system. When we talk about 501c3s, when we talk about tax deductibility, when we talk about whatever 501c organization it may be, a C6, a C9, a C3, these organizations that were operated for charitable purposes were granted tax exemptions, partly because then the government didn't have to address those issues and they could be more effectively addressed in the private sector. Organizations were required that income couldn't be used by an individual with the organization, but for the organization's advancement, and then allowed deductions for contributions so that individuals who made gifts to nonprofit organizations were given a charitable deduction. All of this was part of the governmental plan to provide services. And this whole idea of civil society is built right into our governmental structure. Okay, that's probably enough of the civics lesson, but I want to say one more thing. And that is when a nonprofit organization is created, it becomes a public trust. And any of you who are in very young organizations, especially if they have a single founder, this is sometimes a difficult step for people to understand. This goes all the way back to the early stages of the Massachusetts Bay Company and Harvard University, where nonprofit organizations are governed by citizens boards. And even though they may be created by a single founder or group of founders, it's a public trust, part of the structure of how the American government is put together. I like this quote from Dr. Peter Dobkin Hall. Nonprofit boards serve as the binding which holds together the sticks. That's the political, economic, cultural, public, and private. 5 elements: political, economic, cultural, public, and private that comprise public life. What we do in our sector is really important, and it's really important to building a civil society. So now it's time to talk about this idea of the life cycle of a nonprofit organization. I like to leave this picture up here just because I love her eyes. But I have this picture of this little girl because a child moves through predictable stages as they mature. As I have said, so do nonprofit organizations. Boards, organizations move through predictable phases. And just like it's easier to understand a child who's in the terrible twos, if you've had kids or been around kids, you know that's a natural part of their development, as difficult as it may be. The same thing is true with boards. There are natural things that go on in board development. And if you know what's going on and why those things are happening, it's a little easier to manage them, and it's a lot easier to help the organization grow. Understanding and clarifying all of this, the board's role and where it's at in its phases of development is essential because it impacts the rest of our work. Who and how are people involved? What level of commitment do people have to the organization? What sense of partnership is there with all of the organization or all of the people that are involved in the organization? And how do we build a strong organization? It's critical in an organization's ability to continue and grow to clarify what the board's role is and where the board is in its development. Now, there are a lot of factors involved as to whether an organization and a board continue to move forward. What's the relationship of the board and its staff? What's their structural relationship? What's the history of how the board was developed? What's the history of how the staff has developed? What's the history of how the two work together? What's the organization's sense of purpose? What about financial security and stability? All of these things are involved into whether a board moves forward. And the issues involving board and staff relationships, what the organization sees as its sense of purpose, what the financial situation of the organization, all create transitions. And this constant state of transition can be very stressful. It can create times that are sometimes unclear. They can be painful, they can be frustrating, they can be laborious as you move through this nonprofit like society. Only boards are capable of selecting and supporting leadership, holding the organization accountable, and serving as the principal guardian of the nonprofit organization's welfare. Now, these roles live with the board, and if they try to sit anywhere else, it's a recipe for disaster. But these three things are so key to the development and the forward motion of the organization that we need to understand how this all comes together. So it's vital to analyze your organization's governance, because without understanding where the governance of your organization sits, it's very difficult to create the next steps. I want you to be thinking about where you are in your development, sort of that, just like a child goes through stages and phases. Where's your organization? Are you a startup or are you in a start over stage? Does the organization grow and then decline in spurts? Does it go up and down? Are you in a period of steady growth? Maybe things are good and it just keeps elevating. Or maybe the organization has stagnated a little. Going through this process of thinking about your organization gets to the heart of the functionality of your organization. And so with that in mind, I want you to think about where your organization is at. Where are you in this process? And we'll define the process more clearly here in a second. But if you don't know where you're going, it doesn't matter where you go, as the Cheshire Cat said in Alice in Wonderland. So I'm going to ask you a series of questions. In this video, I'm just going to put them up on the screen. When we are in Las Vegas, we're going to break into some smaller groups to have discussions about these questions. But these questions are key. So as I put them on the screen, I'd like you to grab a sheet of paper, grab a legal pad or something like this, and actually write down some notes from these questions I'm going to ask as to where you fit in this continuum. So let's begin. Is your organization funded by the founders? Is your organization totally volunteer driven? Or do you have some staff? Do you have some leadership? Is there a super high passion for the cause? Is there a single solution approach to whatever it is you're doing to try to make a better world? Is your programming well established, or is it trial by error? Are you using manual systems of administration? Do you have a good finance program? Do you have a good fundraising software program? Or are you still doing things on paper? I had someone ask me the other day, do you know free software system where I could keep my records, and one of my colleagues said, well, Excel. Anyway, how about compliance? Are people thinking about complying with laws and ethics and other things as an afterthought, or is it always built into your organization's thinking? Is there good public reporting in your organization? How many funders do you have? Do you have a few key funders that make everything happen, or do you have a broad base of support? And what's your branding like? Do people know who you are? Does your name make sense? When you go out and talk to potential funders, do they know who you are? Now, these are some of the symptoms, I would say, of a new organization. Let's talk about some of the questions that may be for the next step in organizational development. Got some more questions for you. Let's see if there's any of those questions match with you, and hope that you wrote down one or two here if they apply to you. Do the founders approve what happens in the organization, or do they do it all? Is there staff, and is this staff maybe the first person who's ever filled in an executive directorship role, and they're a generalist, and they've been hired as the first staff member, which means they have to be able to do everything, which is fundraise and keep the minutes and do the books and do the publications and on, you know what I'm talking about. Is there more passion in your organization than there is talent to execute the work that the organization needs to do? Are there key program partners starting to appear? Are there other people that you work with, either in providing your program or who can support the program? Are your program and services expanding? Are you growing? Are things starting to standardize? No longer are we keeping things on a sheet of paper, but maybe we have standard policies and procedures going on. Are you starting to have basic systems of administration, or is it all being run from the kitchen table of the founders? Are you starting to think about core compliance? Are the 990s getting done? Are all of the tax forms being completed? Are people being paid on a regular basis? Do you have a growing base of funders? Do you have good branding and marketing? You can see this set of questions is for an organization that is a little further along than that first set of questions. Do any of these apply to you? Write them down if any of them do. Now let's talk about another set of questions for an organization that's in another situation, a little more mature. Are there executive leaders? Is there a president or executive director or a CEO that works with board leaders? And is there a board chair? And is the board chair and the executive leader working hand in hand to move the organization forward? Is there specialized expertise available? Is somebody dealing with finance? Is somebody dealing with development? Is someone dealing with the program? Is there adequate and dedicated staff, or is everything so tight that you can't get all of it done? Are your programs refined? Are your services refined? Do you, when someone asks you what you do, can you clearly say, this is what we do and why we do it? Are your processes, your administrative processes, being measured? Is someone concerned about the impact that the organization is making and the return on investment for the money that goes in for what's being returned? Are your administration systems integrated into the process of the organization? Is corporate compliance built in? You know, it's just natural that your tax forms are going to be done. It's just natural that all of your taxes are going to be paid, and you're fully ethical and corporately compliant. Is your fundraising portfolio managed? Do you have records of your donors? Are you doing appropriate acknowledgments and thank yous and those sorts of things? Everything we would do as a good professional fundraiser. And is your funding to the point where now it's predictable? You know that you can raise a certain amount of money, and you've got a large base of donors. You've got donors that you're acquiring through annual giving. You have established annual giving program. You have a major gifts program. You do a capital campaign every once in a while. And then you've got exceptional branding and marketing. People know who you are. They know who the organization is, and the messaging that you put out is appropriate and correct. I hope some of these questions got you thinking about where your organization might be. There are lots of different models of defining what stage the organization is. You'll hear words like, is the organization in its infancy? Is it a juvenile as far as an organization, in its adolescence or full maturity? We're going to talk more about that in just a second. In Las Vegas, we're going to be having a little discussion here about some of the questions that we just talked about. And I think for you and I now in the video, we've been talking for a long time. We're going to take just a bit of a break, and then we'll be back in just a few seconds. Hi, we're back. Hope you had a good break. We want to go now and talk about the actual phases that a board goes through as it goes through its development. I'll go back to my PowerPoint here. And I want you to keep this question in mind. I asked all those questions before the break because I wanted you to start thinking about where your organization is in this process of board development. There are very particular phases, and we're going to be talking about those now. As a nonprofit passes through these predictable stages, so do their boards. And I'm going to be using the model that was proposed by Carl Mathiasen quite some time ago. And like I said, there are other models, but they all sort of talk about the same things. You may hear talk about infancy and juvenile boards and adolescent boards and mature boards. What Mathiasen did is he talked about the organizing board, and then the transition out of moving from an organizing board to a governing board, and the transition of moving out of a governing board and moving into being an institutional board. Really 5 steps. And we are primarily today going to be talking about the organizing board, and the transition to being a governing board. So those 3 components are mostly what we're going to be talking about today. We'll talk a little bit about the institutional board, but by the time you've reached an institutional board, many of the issues that we're going to be talking about today are solved. And so we're not going to spend a lot of time on the institutional board. But especially for the organizing board and the governing board, which I think is for most people who are taking part in this seminar, are going to be of most interest. So like I said, we're talking about the organizing board. This is the board that is often started, like I said, at a kitchen table with one particular founder who wants to solve an issue, or maybe a small group. Then if the board survives and the organization survives, it transitions to a governing board, and where there's more typically the executive director and the board chair, the staff and the board. And then it transitions to an institutional board. And this would be an organization that usually has been around a while, be a hospital, a university, something that's very deeply ingrained into the community. So think about, as I'm going through this, where your organization is at. Which one of these steps is your organization at? So let's start with stage one, the organizing board. This is often started by a single leader or a band of warriors who want to change the world. It's a small group. Their members are primarily passive of the board, and we'll talk about that in a minute. They care about the organization, but they've probably been asked by the leader or the leaders to come together to help support them, and they primarily support through cheerleading. Yay, we love what you're doing, it's great. I got other stuff going on, but hey, you just do a great job. The boards are often homogeneous because they've been asked by a single founder. It's usually their friends, and so those people on the board end up looking a lot like the people who founded the organization. The meetings and relationships are informal. Lots of times there aren't even agendas when you come to board meetings. And the board and staff roles, if there is staff, are often indistinct. And oftentimes the founder ends up being the first employee of the organization. Board members at this organizing board stage are usually not task oriented. Again, they're there for cheerleaders. They're there because they're buddies of the founder. And they're not expecting to volunteer their time and energy, skills to run an organization. And there's no staff. So who's going to do the programming? Who's going to administrate things? Who's going to fundraise for the organization? So that means that board members are assigned jobs, and oftentimes the jobs just don't get done. You go to one board meeting, people raise their hand, they're going to do something. You come back to the next board meeting, and the same people are raising their hands to do the jobs that they didn't do the last time you had a board meeting. And what happens then is that when jobs don't get done, then the leader picks up and they complete the task because they feel they have to, because they've got a sense of ownership. This is their organization in their minds, and they haven't made this step to becoming a public trust, like we talked about a little earlier. And then the sense of resentment starts to sneak in. And it sneaks in throughout the organization. And this is when an organization starts to transition from being an organizing structure to being a governing structure. And this transition period really can be difficult, but it's absolutely required for the organization to move forward and for the organization's growth. So let's talk about this transition. You know, once there's this struggle, this whole crisis begins to happen in transitioning to a governing board, because the organization is either doesn't have the finances it needs, or the leader is starting to feel a little burnt out, and they can't cope with all of the tasks and the assignments that it is required to running a nonprofit organization. You know, I often chuckle when people say they're going to retire and go work for a nonprofit organization so they can relax a little bit and not work so hard. As we all know, this is the hardest work in the world sometimes. And people aren't ready for that. When people start a nonprofit organization, it is as big a deal as the startup of any for-profit business. And there's another thing that happens where this kind of resentment starts to grow between who's leading who. Is the staff leading the board? Is the board leading the staff? Is the founder leading the board? The board is trying to tell the founder what to do. The founder thinks of this as their own thing, and they're going to do what they want to do no matter what the board says. And the board starts to struggle to define its new role, as does the leadership. And the leader eventually realizes that he or she needs help in managing what is becoming an increasingly more complex organization. Somebody needs to take care of the books. Somebody needs to raise the money. Somebody needs to make sure that the program is being done effectively. And expectations on the board members start to change. Rather than being cheerleaders, they need to be fundraisers. Rather than being cheerleaders, they need to be financial managers, planners, committee chairs. They need to start doing the work that most of us who've been in this work for a long time think of as the board's work. And a process of negotiation begins. There's this mutual tension and almost exasperation that starts to creep into the conversations. And this transition to a new board phase begins. If you've ever been involved with a young organization, it's at this point when board members start to get very frustrated. Staff members, and it's usually just one or two people because they're in the early stages of the organization. They can't afford to have more professional staff. It becomes a very perplexing and frustrating time. And this is when board members get up and leave. And this is the same time that sometimes staff leave if they can afford to leave. And this is difficult, but once again, it's a natural growing process. Board members fulfill certain roles in the life of the organization at certain times. And remember, a board functions as a body. And if the people who make up the body aren't comfortable there or it doesn't fit anymore, then they move on and some other people take over who also have a passion for the organization's programming. And new members join the board. And these new members bring new lifeblood, they bring new ideas, maybe they've got some experience on being in a board, and you start to see this transition. Any of this sound familiar? Especially those of you who have had board members just get up and leave at one of these points of transition. You start to move in then into this governing board stage, and a new style of leadership starts to develop. It's more shared between the board and the staff. You start to see organized systems being developed for administration, for finance, for the programming. The programming becomes less trial and error and much more established. And they're much more clear definition of the roles that the staff's going to play and that the board's going to play. And you start hearing language like this. We need to start acting like a board. You know, we need to start having agendas. We need to have committee reports. We need to have minutes. We have to do our 9-day. Another one is we have to become more business-like. I always, that's another one of those phrases, because people in the for-profit sector often think they'll go into the nonprofit sector, like I said, if they retire, or they're going to go in and think there's less work in the nonprofit sector, not realizing that those of us in this world have to be especially creative to make this work, because we aren't necessarily selling anything to make our operation smooth. The thing that happens now is the pace of change starts to accelerate. You start to things really start to happen, and you start to see the hiring of staff. You start to see fundraising programs start to become more established. You see a broader base of funders coming about. And the board starts taking responsibility for what's going on. They realize that they are responsible for the sustainability, the longevity, the well-being of the organization. And then you start seeing the board take responsibility for, let's do strategic planning. Let's provide financial oversight. Let's be accountable for the integrity of this organization. And you start to see a new and more balanced relationship, and a sharing of power and authority begins to happen between the staff and between the board. At the same time, the board chair and the executive director, or the CEO, start to emerge as the principal leaders. They work together, and the board chair is moving forth with the policies and the vision of the organization, while the chief executive is moving forward with the management and the day-to-day mission of the organization. And so they accept the responsibility and make sure that the work gets done for the organization. And then the board starts to hold itself accountable to the needs of the organization. We're not cheerleading anymore. The board takes responsibility for making sure that things happen. The organization has the resources it needs to operate, and it is indeed operating effectively and changing the world in the way that the board sees fit. Now, that may not be exactly the way the organization is founded, but the organization will find its place as it moves through this process. The board starts to get a little more arm's length of a governance stance. This is the whole thing about the board creating a vision and a strategy, and the staff managing the operation. Often boards get larger, and the choice of board member gets more intentional. That's a key thing, and we'll talk more about intentionality of board members in a minute. Committees become essential, the kind of committees that we all think about for mature operating organizations. Finance committee, nominating governance type committees, putting together a fundraising board or a fundraising committee, marketing committees, and all of the other things. And you start to see policies develop. The organization starts doing things consistently. You start seeing manuals being developed, and you see much more effective governance. So those really are the components. But one of the things I would say, we think about this as a linear process: organizing, transition, governing board, transition, institutional board. When in fact, the more that I work with boards, I see there's a process of transitions going on all the time between these three steps, and especially between the organizing board and the governing board. I see organizations go back and forth between these two processes pretty regularly. And occasionally it'll happen over here on the other side. But I think when you start thinking about nonprofit management, you can think about it as managing the transitions that are going on in the governance of the board, between the organizing and the governing boards especially. I want to talk a little bit about the institutional board, this third step. And for those of you who work in hospitals or universities or long established community organizations, it's a little different. You don't see some of that consternation you see going on between the organizing and governing boards. Like I said, this third step is more of a community institution. These are organizations that are usually successful and growing, and the organization has gotten to the point where it's greater than any individual. And if the president of the organization leaves, if the board chair leaves, if people move in and out, the organization's not going to go away. And the board plays a different role. The board starts representing different bodies, different regions, different constituencies. And they realize that they, as a board, need to help provide the visibility for the organization by using their sphere of influence and the people that they know and the organizations they connected with can help the organization. So fundraising, along with staff help, of course, becomes a primary task of the institutional board, and a larger board attracts movers and shakers. And lots of times, especially when you get into universities, you'll see a small executive committee that holds the power. Then you'll have a much, much, much larger board that may meet occasionally. And that's really the function of the institutional board. So I hope as you think about those steps that you can think about organizing board, governing board, institutional board, where are you at? So now that you know these points, so what do we do with this? As an organization, you need to take stock. You need to assess where the organization is at, both internally and externally. Try to figure out where in that development process your board and your organization is at. You need to identify needs. What are your staff needs? What are your board needs? Staff needs are going to be, you're going to have some administration needs that are in common, but they're going to be much more particular to the programming you're trying to provide. But I'm going to talk more about your board needs in a minute here. And then you may need to get help. When I say that, there's lots of resources out there. AFP has resources, and of course you can go to the web and get all sorts of resources. But this also may be a time to bring on a consultant. Now, I know that I'm a consultant, and I'm not trying to sell my my services, but it's often very helpful, especially at these moments of change in board governance, to bring on a consultant who can provide some external view, maybe can provide some services like getting an assessment done of the organization, maybe doing a organizational operational audit or a development audit, and do some sort of assessment process. And they can also help in planning. I think one of the things that really helps a board figure out where they're at is to go through a strategic planning process, because it forces them to look at what is it that's causing all of these things to happen. I mean, the other thing, and for established boards, this is natural, but the other component is to take a retreat. Take some time together as a board where you can do a deep dive on some of these larger issues that aren't necessarily programmatic, but they're really about how's the board want to work together? How's the board structure? What's causing the positive things or the negative things that are happening within the board? Hello, John. We found a volunteer who's willing to be on the board. I think this happens more than it should. And I want to talk a little bit about how you develop this mature board of directors, this board that can establish direction, ensure resources, provide oversight. And that means being very intentional on how you choose your board members. Good board members have to have the ability to listen, analyze, think clearly and creatively, and work well with both individuals and groups. They have to be ready to prepare for a board meeting and prepare for committee meetings, to take this seriously. It's not something where you just blow in off the street and you haven't thought about what's going on with the organization. They need to be ready to ask relevant questions. They're not yes people, just yes people. They need to take responsibility, follow through on the assignments that they have as a board member, and contribute personally with financial resources and with their time in a generous way, and open doors in the community. Then they also need to evaluate themselves. Board members need to turn around and look at, let's evaluate the board, and let's evaluate ourselves as members of that board. And that helps. You have to have certain skills, and you may have to develop skills. That's cultivating and soliciting funds, cultivating and recruiting board members and other volunteers, being self-perpetuating, and playing that role of nominating and governance, reading and understanding financial statements, learning more about the substantive programming of the organization. And I think this gets overlooked a lot too, and that's character. What sort of people should be representing your organization? Honesty, sensitivity, tolerance to varying views within the organization, being friendly, responsive, patient, community building skills, personal integrity and a sense of values, and a concern for the organization's development, and maintaining a sense of humor makes everything a little bit easier to work through. To all of you who have come to our gala benefit, welcome and thank you for supporting us and for being here tonight. But most of all, thank you for being rich. I hope you get the point of that. We all want people of means and capacity on our board, but you need to have people of all types. That means be intentional about this process of choosing board members. And this isn't something you do 1 week out of the year. It's not something you do a month out of the year. This is something where you plan ahead 3-4 years at a time. The best board members are already on somebody else's board. And you want to find people who care about the organization, who have the skill set that you need. And you need to cultivate these people just like you would cultivate them for a gift. You're going to cultivate them for their leadership. They're going to be giving your time. And for a lot of people, their time is very, very valuable. And you want to build a matrix of skills that the board needs. Do you need someone who's an expert in your program areas? Do you need someone who has some financial expertise? Do you need someone who might have legal expertise? Do you need to consider diversity, equity, access, all of those things so that you can build an appropriate board. And then once you've got the board connected, you need to prepare and orient the board members by clarifying their role, making sure what they know what their responsibilities are, and you have high expectations for the board. And you follow and endorse the bylaws. I'm amazed at how many, whenever I start working with a client, one of the first things I do is I go and I check their corporate structure with the state. I check their status with the IRS. I get a set of their bylaws. I get the board list, and we start looking at, are you following your own set of rules? And it's amazing to me how many organizations don't. One board member gets to be on the board forever just because they gave some money, or because they wanna, or because, you get my point. You know what I'm talking about. Follow and enforce the bylaws. The board needs to build and follow their own board policies. And then I think it's really important to have a board contract or a board agreement or something like that, and to use it. And the board contract identifies things like, what are the giving expectations? What are the board attendance expectations? What are the other financial expectations, and on and on and on. So that, and you can get on the internet, there's all kinds of examples of these sorts of things, but it really helps when you're recruiting people to lay out clearly what you want people to do. So there's never any question about that. And I think the board contract is a key part of recruiting your board members so that they know exactly what you want. And don't ever recruit a board member saying, hey, we're never going to expect you to make a gift. You never ever make a gift to this organization. Oh, and you don't ever have to raise money too. And I know there's some people who can't raise money, but they can be involved in the fundraising process some way or another. That's a whole nother session. So as you are trying to build this mature board of directors, you analyze the board, you figure out exactly where you're at, you lay out some steps as to how you're going to get there, and you lay out a clear plan, and it seems that it's smooth sailing. Inevitably, when you're working with boards, when you're working with people, there are a lot of stumbling over stones and going across rivers and going through storms. But going through this process, listening to the brook and the stream and the struggle of the water going over the rocks, creates an exciting time moving towards a really effective and a mature board of directors. But you've got to remember, there are natural steps that boards go through as they're growing and they're developing. And if you know what those are, and you have a little bit of an idea what those are going to be, you can plan for them and help the board mature, just like you help a child mature and help them go through being a baby, moving to being a toddler, going through adolescence, and growing into a mature and strong organization. So with that, I want to remind you of where we started and one of the reasons that I'm in this work, and that is the true meaning of life is to plant trees under whose shade you do not expect to sit. And this work in board development is sometimes difficult, but very rewarding. And it's essential to the organization being successful. And it's also, if you're a professional fundraiser, it's also essential for you to get your work done, because having a board who gets it, who understands that they are responsible for the financial resources and the other resources required for the organization to grow and change is really critical. So with that, I want to thank you again for joining me today. Thank you for being a part of AFP. And I hope that by the time you see this, that you enjoyed ICON, or you enjoyed some of the materials that you've gotten from the International Fundraising Conference in 2022. And I want to thank you all for joining me for this session. And if you want to contact me, here's my contact information, phone number, email, website. I would be happy to help in any way I can. And I guess I got to go answer my phone. So thank you very much. And we will see you next time. Hopefully we'll see you at ICON 2023.